Okay, Rabbi Isai, I'm just setting up the recording. Okay, so, oh no, the signatures have faded on our Ketubah. Okay, so that's the topic tonight, and that's from Harry Roz. That's a quote from Harry Roz. Yeah, okay. You were prepared to walk out on your wife, I know, yeah, but we understand, yeah. Okay, so, all right, so that was really the question. Harry had a legitimate question, which was, we hung up our ksuv on the wall some, how many years ago? Many years ago, perhaps 3.5 decades. Yeah, 33 and a half years ago. And of course, first of all, the practice of hanging your ketubah on the wall is a questionable practice. I'm not saying that it's good. I'm not saying that it's not good. I'm just saying that it's in itself a questionable practice, because when you think about it, it is a promissory note that your wife is holding against her husband. And it may not be advisable for a husband to have full access to that promissory note, because it almost defeats the whole purpose. Chazal instituted the ketubah as a weapon that a wife has to disincentivize a husband on a whim to divorce his wife. So a lot of poskim frown on the practice of hanging up the ketubah on the wall. But another potential liability, and others, by the way, are okay with it. In other words, I don't want you to feel you have to remove the ketubah off your wall, but just understand that there is a question in halacha about that in general. But one of the problems is that it's very easy for, over time, the ink, especially of the signatures of the witnesses, to fade, because a lot of times the ink may have been blue and not black, and even with the black ink pen, sometimes the ballpoint pens do not leave such an indelible mark, and sometimes a witness's signature may have been very light because he was scared of making a mistake, so he was very cautious. So a lot of things can happen. So over the course of decades, the signatures can fade. And so Harry found himself with the problem that he could almost not see the signatures anymore. By the way, I have the same problem with my smicha certificate from Rav Ruderman. The signature has faded over the years. So there may come a point where I'm no longer welcome as your rabbi if that actually ever happens. But and I'm sure Neri Sol would be very happy. But anyway, so the Gemara says in Talmud Bavli, the Gemara says in Ksuvas, Kesuva Hainu Taima, source number 1, Shalote Hekala Be'inav Lahotzia, that the whole reason why Chazal instituted the writing of a Ksuva is to make it a little bit more difficult for a husband to divorce his wife. We don't want a husband to feel that he can divorce his wife at a whim, so we create a financial disincentive for him to do so by creating debt at the beginning of the marriage, so he'll think twice before releasing his wife from the marriage. And as the Torah writes, Siman Samech Vav and Even HaEzer, let's just take a look. You're not allowed to have yichud with your bride before you give her a ksuva. And furthermore, the husband is obligated to hire and pay for the cost of the provision of the ketubah. That actually should come from the expenses of the wedding from the husband's side, because the rabbis made him give her the ketubah. She assumes no liability. Another interesting shaila. We go to ketubah.com and they charge $800 for the particular ketubah that we want to get. Is that included in this halacha that the husband has to pay all of it, or do they share in the expense? My argument would be that you can get a $5 ksuva or maybe a $10 ksuva, and that's perfectly fine. So if they want the artwork, then I don't think that would fall under this category that the Baal has to pay for the sofer. Now, the Torah explains why you're not allowed to have yichud with the kala before giving her a ksuva. Shechachamim tiknu ksuva leisha kedei shelo tehei kala be'inav lahotzia. so that it should not be easy in the husband's eyes to release his wife, to divorce her. And even if a husband wishes to say, you know what, I haven't had a chance to write up the ksuva yet, but here's a bag of money that I'm putting into escrow for you, or any other kind of sort of guarantee or assurance, a financial assurance, ein shomin lo. That is not sufficient. He can't even say, I'll leave a bag of money with your family as collateral, and that will allow us to live together as husband and wife. That's not acceptable. But rather, it is necessary to write an actual shtar, b'demei hakasuva, writing in the value of the entire ksuva, and all of a husband's assets are placed on a lien. A lien is placed on them to make sure that his entire estate is liable. If a husband gives his wife a ksuva and it gets lost, shemachla lo aleha, or if, let's say, a wife says, I love you so much, honey, for this year's anniversary present, I'm giving you back the ksuva, which is that's a pretty expensive gift, right? In other words, even according to our standards today, a ksuva for a basulta is a five-figure sum. Some may argue it's only around $25,000 to $30,000 Canadian, but still, that's not chump change. And so if she says, I'm moichel the ksuva, and that's my gift to you, shekasvelo hiskabalti ksuvasi, and she writes, I have received my ksuva payment, and therefore, and the husband holds on to that. That's like basically saying, this promissory note has been paid in full. It's no different from writing that to a debtor. Like if I'm a creditor and I have a promissory note, and the debtor pays back the loan, I can either tear up the promissory note as demonstration of payment of debt, or I can hold on to the promissory note and give a receipt to the debtor saying the debt has been paid in full. And if she does that, that's a problem also. Then it would not be permitted for a husband and wife to live together, to have yichud with each other. Even though she's giving her husband the ksuva of her own volition, she's moichel the ksuva, they still cannot live together. And notice that the Torah says that the husband has to write her a new ksuva, but it doesn't have to have the tosefes. It doesn't have to have the requisite additional amount that has become the custom in more recent years to add to the ksuva. It just has to be the masayim zuz, and it doesn't have to include any additional items. And the reason is that it is usher for a husband to live with his wife even for one moment without a ksuva. Now, this is a very relevant halacha in and of itself, in that I know that there are people who have lost, where the wife has misplaced the ksuva. We've moved several times. I don't know where the ksuva is. I can't find it. And you know, when I get these shilas, when the husband and wife, either they go for a get, because the beis din asks for the copy of the ksuva at the time of the get, or when we're looking to be able to provide a letter for aliyah for one of the kids, and I say, show me your mom's ksuva, we can't find it. It's another situation where this halacha is relevant, where what must be done? We need to write another ksuva for the mother. And the wife not only is entitled to her ksuva, but it's necessary halachically to write a ksuva to one's wife in the event she lost her ksuva. And so long as the ksuva is not written, the husband and wife can't even have yichud with each other. That is the takanas chachamim. It might be a rationale for hanging it on the wall. You know, you won't lose it. Okay. So that's the thing, is that you can't backdate it, because that would be a forged star. Just like I can't backdate a promissory note, because that would be illegitimate. That's an illegal document because it contains falsehood in it. I can't backdate a ksuva. So we have a document called the Ketubah de Irkisa. And what that is basically saying there's a whole text that's contained in the Sefer Nachal HaShiva. Nachal HaShiva goes through all of the halachos that a Masader Kiddushin and a Masader Gittin need to know in order to get the proper text. And a Ketubah de Irkisa is one of those texts. And the word Irkisa means it was lost. So it's a separate text, and it basically says that on such and such a date, Adam and Chava got married, and she lost her Ketubah. And so therefore, now on this new date, in front of these Eidim, we are writing her a new Ketubah. So, and the reason why it's important to put both dates in is that you don't want to cast aspersions on the children of Adam and Chava. So if they, after 120 years, when they go through mom and dad's paperwork, they're not going to see a Ketubah that says that they got married 20 years after they were born, right? But it's a Ketubah de Irkisa, which says they were married long before they were born, and now a new Ketubah was written because the old one was lost. So it has both dates. And what? Yeah, you need two Eidim. You do not need the original Eidim. You do not need the original Eidim. You can have, what if the original Eidim passed away, right? You do not need the original Eidim. No, because it's a new promissory note. No. No. Well, there's an Anan Sahadi, and the date of the wedding is not required for evidentiary purposes. It's required to remove any aspersions that might be cast on the progeny. So it's not a necessary component of the promissory note. It's still a collectible promissory note, even if you didn't put the date of the wedding. It's put in for the sake of the children. Okay? Now, the preacher writes, as we pointed out, be'ikr haksuva, if she loses the ksuva, you write her a new one, or if she's moichel the ksuva, you write her a new one. Dahainu masaim lebesula umana la'almana, that you only give her the 200 or the 100 if she was moichel her ksuva, and you have to write a new one. Aval hatosefes ein tzarich lachzor belichtav la kishemachla im lo benevda. But if the ksuva is lost, you do have to write all of the tosefes in the Ketubah de Irkisa, the lost Ketubah replacement, because we don't penalize a woman for losing her Ketubah and say to her, well, because you lost the Ketubah, you lose out on your tosefes, on the additional amount that was originally gifted to you or indebted to you. The Aruch HaShulchan also writes that, and this is really a paraphrase of the Shulchan Aruch, Nimchak hashtar onitashdesh, if, let's say, the shtar, the text of the shtar is erased, the whole thing fades out. We're not talking now just about the chasima sa'idim, about these signatures. We're talking about the entire text of the Ketubah. Becomes illegible because the ink has faded so much. Oni tashtesh, or if it's smudged. Im rishumoni kar kasher v'im lav pasul. So if the imprint of the original letters is legible, so then it's still a kosher Ketubah. And that's one of the initial questions that I asked Harry, is can you still make out the signatures even though it's faded? And you said, yes, you can. So I said to you at that point, well, then what you should do is prevent it from fading further by putting some kind of paper over the signatures to prevent the sunlight from hitting it in the future, but it's still a kosher Ketubah. But if it's completely faded and you cannot make it out any longer, so then it's puzzle. And presumably the same thing would be true if the entire text of the Ketubah is legible, but the witnesses' signatures are completely now invisible, because any contract without signatures witnesses is not a valid contract. Ele imkain mevi hamal ve'edem sha'al pi siba nimchak oni tashtesh. Unless the creditor, and this, by the way, is a halacha in Choshen Mishpat. This is not even a halacha in Hilchos Even HaEzer. This is just contract law. So if we're talking about a promissory note, the promissory note gets faded, so then it's no longer kosher if you can't make out the initial writing, unless the creditor can provide to a beis din a legitimate reason why the promissory note was faded or erased or smudged. the imrishumoni kar, the habestin roim. In other words, the creditor would have to bring witnesses to say, we signed this, we remember this promissory note, and the Basin would write a new promissory note acknowledging that the lien dates back to the original time, because the Basin sees that the shtar has been mikuyam, has been supported. Here there would be a difference. The question is, how far back does the lien go on the person's estate? In a situation where a woman loses her ksuva, she forfeits the lien that started on the man's property back in, the 30 years ago when they got married, and only a new lien is generated on his current assets. Usually it's not so much of a problem, because as people get older, they accumulate more wealth, but not always. Let's say at one point a man had a much larger amount of wealth in his earlier part of his life, and then he had a reduction in wealth. The lien that you write for the ksuva de irkasa would only set in at the time when the ksuva is being written. So, well, I don't think the nichse milug is dependent upon the ksuva. The nichse milug is something that is awarded to the husband. Well, they are married, whether or not she has a ksuva. No, we're not. Ketubah bears no weight on the legitimacy of the marriage. They are 100% married. If he wants to divorce her, he has to give her a get, and he's entitled to her nichse milug even if she doesn't have a ketubah. At least that's my understanding. So, yeah. So anyway. Ooh, that's a great question. So we're going to get to that shaila momentarily. We'll get to that shaila in a minute. Okay. So now, v'habeistin roin shaba'od zman yismachek legamre. If the Basin also can see that the contract is about to fade, and they want to prevent it from fading, osim lo shtar acher, then they should write him a new document and just basically say that this document is reflective of a lien on a person's property and a debt that was generated on such and such a date. So the Basin, has foresight. So in a situation where the ksuva is completely faded, if the creditor who's holding the promissory note cannot produce witnesses who can testify about that document, he's out of luck. And if the debtor chooses to default on that loan and deny owing the money, the creditor is out of luck. Okay, if the text is still legible but faded and is about to fade into invisibility, then the Basin should write him another promissory note reflective of the original text. Okay.
Found out that one of the people who signed the Ketubah was a Masachet Ketubah, all
Right. He was Puzzle Aedis,
yeah. Or he was really a relative to the other side, or he was some Russia for some other reason that he shouldn't be. So is Ketubah not valid?
The Ketubah, presumably, if a person who's Puzzle Aedis signed the Ketubah is not valid. Probably would have to write a new one with a new Eidim. It wouldn't be called a ksuva de irkasa, but there is another text for any time a psul is found in a ksuva, which is also in that Sefer Nachal Shiva, that we found the psul in the original ksuva, and we're rewriting the ksuva for the wedding that took place on such and such a day. Yeah, but that's true, David. Yeah, absolutely. If there's a psul, what happens if the wrong name was put into the ksuva? What happens if one of the witnesses is not Jewish or not a kosher aid? A number of things could create a psul in the ksuva. And certainly, two eidim are a necessary component of any legal document in halacha that has financial ramifications.
So let's say the wife knows. The wife says, "I know it was in. I know it was in." So how long do you have to wait in order to determine that?
That's a very valid question. I noticed that the poskim deal with this shaila. we're going to get to that in a moment as far as how you should watch the ksuva and how you have to be careful. And if it gets lost, how long do you have to look for it before you give up, right? And so it seems from the poskim that as long as you're continuing to look for it, it's not, you haven't given up on it yet. But once you give up on looking for it on a continual basis, then you have to assume that it's lost and you got to go write a new one. And by the way, I've done these before. It's not a big deal to do a ksuva d'irkasa. It's really not. There's a bunch of blank ksuva d'irkasas in my office, and we'll be happy to write one up for you and make an honest man out of you. Okay, so I found this really interesting sefer called Shtar HaKsuva. It's a contemporary sefer by a rabbi in Israel named Rav Moshe Vilger, and he writes all of the ins and outs of writing a ksuva. And he has a whole chapter about ksuvas that get lost, ksuvas that get faded, and ksuvas that have to be rewritten for whatever reason. So first of all, he writes an interesting thing. And the reason I include this is because it's such a common occurrence for those of you who are making weddings, especially if you're the parent of the kala. You have to be really, really careful about the following. Yesh li zaher shela'achar hachupa yatzniu haksuva b'makom mishtamer. You have to be very careful that after the chasana, right after the chuppah, what happens? There's pandemonium that breaks out right after the chuppah. You've all been there. You see what the pandemonium that breaks out. There's only one problem, is that while everyone's celebrating, the chassan and kala go to the yichud room, who's holding the ksuva? So usually what we do is we give it to the mother of the kala. Some people make a joke out of it, the mom holds the purse strings and everything like that. But in reality, it's a serious issue, because often what happens is the ksuva gets lost the night of the wedding. And this has happened a number of times in my own experience. So they should put it bein cheftze hakala o aim hakala shelo lishkoach v'yovad haksuva. They should either put it in the bride's room with her gifts and her clothes and her suitcase and whatever she needs, or they should give it to the mother of the bride to hold it for safekeeping. Ukvar hizir bazeh hamachatzis hashekel. And I looked at this up in the original, but it's basically a direct quote. The Machatzis HaShekel talks about this in his commentary to Hilchos Ksuva. He says, Shiyeh shela'achar hachupa lo yasumu ayin al haksuva. He says a lot of times after the chuppah, no one's paying attention to the ksuva. And you can probably speak to Kalman. He probably has plenty of stories for you also. Sha'anshe mishpacha lo chenosa. He says that what happens is someone in the family ends up taking the ksuva, and then they run off and they start dancing, and then the catering crew and the custodian, the facility staff end up cleaning up all the garbage, and they end up throwing the ksuva away. And then it turns out that the husband is living illicitly with his new bride. Okay, v'lachein kol mi sheyirat Hashem nogea bilvavo yireh shetekaf umiyad achar hachuppah yitnu haksuva lemakom hamishtamer. So God-fearing Jews should really pay careful attention to this and place the ksuva in a well-known, safe, secure place where everyone knows where it is and you can go back and it's protected. Ulamaisa im yesh tzad she'aksuva munachas eitzel eim hakala. Now, you ask Howard, what if we can't find it after the wedding? Oh no, what happened to the ksuva? We don't know where it is. The bride and groom are about to leave. It's midnight. All the guests have left. It's after Sheva Brachas, and they want to go to their hotel. And all of a sudden, the bride says, I can't find my ksuva. What happened? What are we going to do? So if you know that I know I gave it to my mother, the Kala says, or if you know that it's with the other gifts, you know that someone's got it, and it's got to be there with the other stuff. So in that kind of situation, I just want to make sure that this is being Oh, that's sweet. Thank you. I just want to make sure I'm still recording. Just give me a second. Oh, my video was off the whole time. Okay. I'm sorry about that. I think. Okay. Right. Or if you know that if you know that mom, the ketubah was given to mom at some point in the evening, so then efshar lismoch al zeh. He quotes the Shevet Halevi by saying you could be somech on that. The bride doesn't have to be neurotic on the night of her wedding, fearing that the ketubah is lost if she knows she gave it to her mother. And in a really b'diavad situation, since there were witnesses that saw the Mesiras HaKsuva, that saw that the groom indebted himself to the ksuva. They also saw the groom give the ksuva to the bride. And some say that in such a situation where you don't know where the ksuva is, and it's the night of the wedding, the husband should give a certain amount, doesn't even say how much, a certain amount of cash to his wife and accept upon himself full responsibility for the full amount of the ksuva. And they should rely on that until they search for the ksuva. And one second, and as the husband, what he should do is he should write his wife a check for the total amount of what the ksuva is worth. Let her hold on to it. He may not even have that amount in the bank, who knows? But he should at least write her a check for whatever amount he can muster together, and that would be sufficient in that kind of dire situation where they're leaving and no one knows where the ksuba is. I think, yeah, no, I don't think this works. I think this is only a kula for the night of the wedding.
It sounds like this ketubah doesn't have to be in your possession. You just have to know where it is. Is that right?
You don't have to be holding on to it.
So, I mean, but we have our ketubah. We have to take it off the wall. The glass goes through one of these things. You can send it out to.
Yeah, you can send it out as long as you know you can get it at any time. Your wife has to have access to it. So I guess if she would call the framing store and she could pick it up. I don't think it has to be accessible 24/7. A lot of people would keep their ksuva in the safe deposit box. As long as the wife knows that she knows how to access the ksuva, that would be acceptable. That's an interesting shaila. What if she has to wait until a week before she can access the ksuva, but she knows exactly where it is? It's mashma that it's okay. You don't have to be able to access it at a moment's notice. Perhaps that the argument could be made according to those poskim who don't advocate putting it on the wall. Yeah. I don't know where my wife's ksuva is. And I told her, you shouldn't tell me where you keep your ksuva. Not interested, and I shouldn't know, because the whole function is that it should be a sort of a, not a weapon, but sort of an empowerment that you have to disincentivize me from divorcing you. Okay. Now, yeah. Yeah. Not an invalidity of the marriage. They're still halachically married. But Chazal declare your bia as a bias nus because you're not allowed to have yichud. Still halachically married, but it's considered to be like a bi'ilas nus, right? Everyone knows there's a ksuba, but what if the ksuba doesn't exist anymore? That's right. So, but you can't wait those 10 years. You don't have a right to wait 10 years. You have to, as soon as you realize. Yeah, it's usher to live with your wife. Oh, no, there's no stigma against the children. In other words, you're saying the husband and wife have been married 10 years. She thinks it's in the closet underneath a pile of clothes. She hasn't checked there in years. She now goes because they're moving and she realizes that the ksuba that I thought was in the closet is not there. It must have been cleaned out one Pesach when the housekeeper was cleaning it out and she threw it out with a bunch of papers, right? B'diavad, there's nothing to do about it, right? And there's no ramifications. No, you're correct. Yes, she's not called the zona, right? Because of that. Yeah, right. It is a strong language. That's your point, Laser. Yeah. Yeah, it's a strong language, but it's the language is there deliberately to show the gravity of how much Chazal required you to have a ksuba, not to actually assign her to be a zona. Okay, the next column over, nimchaka haksuva, the ksuva is erased. Stark ksuva shenimchaka o nitashtisha im rishumo nikar kasher. So if the ksuva is erased or smudged or faded, so then if there's still a light imprint of the original letters, then it's kosher. The imlav pasul, and if not, it's pasul. That we learned already. V'lachein ksuva sherishumo nikar ein isor lahashot ishto im ksuva zu. So as long as the ksuva is still legible, even though it's quite faded, as long as you can still make out the letters, you're still allowed to live with your wife on that basis. Ve'im nimcha kulo ve'ein rishumo nikar asur lahashot ishto shaksuva psula. He says if it's completely erased and there's no letters recognizable at all, then the ksuva is pasul. You're not allowed to live with your wife. V'yesh lichtov b'ksuva di'irkasa shenimcha kashtar harishon. And therefore, when you write a new ksuva, you change the nusach of the ksuva di'irkasa. Instead of writing that the ksuva was lost, you write ksuva that was nimchak. It was erased or faded. Next, shtar ksuva she'omed lihimachek ein laha'avir kulmus ulechadesh haktav hayashan. That was what Simi was asking. What happens if the original ksuva has started to fade and I want to be able to prevent it from fading entirely? So I will fill in and write, take a pen and write over the letters. So he says you shouldn't do that. V'yesh lichtov shtar chadash b'veit din. And you should write a new ksuva in Beis Din. Now, whether or not it really requires a Beis Din is a shaila in the poskim. The question also would be, do you need 3 signatories or are 2 signatories sufficient? We won't go into that now, but suffice it to say that the accepted psak is that you only need 2 witnesses for a ksuva de'irkasa and not a full-blown Beis Din. And I just wanted to show you the footnote. We're only going to learn a portion of the footnote because it does go on for a couple of pages. And the footnote is this os hey below. He says, "B'makom shechasimas ha'edim ein kol kach chazak." He says, if this witness's signatures, this is now Harry's case, the witness's signatures is very weak. He says, it's in other words, it's fading and it's almost completely faded. Ein laha'avir al gabe hachatima 8. You're not allowed to take a pen, like Harry can't go ahead and take one of those fine markers and go over the signatures of the witnesses to make it stronger. Great question. We'll learn about photocopies in just a moment, but that's the next tshuva that we're going to see. So hold on to that thought for just a second, Robert. So you're not allowed to fill in or add ink to the fading signatures. He says, and that's true even if by putting some extra ink on the signatures, you can still make out the original signatures. He says, not only is this true, if your new pen has a different color ink from the original signatures. Let's say the original signatures were in blue ink and you're going over it now with black ink or vice versa. He says that for sure is asur. He says because by writing over the signatures, you may be guilty of erasing the original signatures and you're going to pasul the ksuva. Ela afilu im ha'edim chatmu im eit shachor, ein la'avor alav lechatchila eit shachor ulechazeko. But even if the original signature was in black ink, if you just want to make it a thicker black ink, that you're not allowed to do either. V'yesh lahatik b'ktsara makor hasugya b'halacha b'inyan ktav al gabe ktav. So let's just very briefly go over the sugya of writing on top of other writing, which is a whole sugya in the Gemara in Gittin. I think maybe, what page is the Daf Yomi up to right now? Yodalit. So you'll get to this sugya in 5 days, right? It's coming. This is mamish coming up in the daf very, very soon. Udio al gabe sikra, udio al gabe dio. The Gemara talks about multiple different kinds of ink, but we're going to contrast dio and sikra. Dio is black ink, sikra is red ink, or reddish ink. And the Gemara says, itmar hamavir dio al gabe sikra b'Shabbos. If a person has a piece of parchment that has sikra writing, writing that was written with reddish ink, and on Shabbos he goes over that writing with a black pen, black quill. So and we know that in order to be liable for Shabbos, for violating Shabbos, you have to write 2 letters. So he writes shin and mem, and he goes over it, the shin and mem that are already there in reddish ink. He goes over it with a quill that has black ink. So the question is, are you chayiv for ksiva on Shabbos or not? Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish the Amri to Ravayu chayiv shtayim. Not only are you liable, but you're liable for 2 things. Echad mishum kotev ve'echad mishum mochech. You're writing and you're erasing the original writing. But dio al gabe sikra, dio al gabe dio, sikra al gabe sikra patur. He says, if, however, you pass black ink on top of already existing black ink, or red ink on top of already existing red ink, you are neither technically erasing or writing because you haven't added anything new to the writing that was previously there. And you're not erasing the previous writing because you're not superimposing a new color, a darker color on it. But sikral gabe dio. But what happens if on Shabbos you take red ink and you pass it over with a quill onto 2 letters that are black ink? So the pre-existing ink is black, and you take a quill with reddish ink, which is a lighter ink, and you pass it over those 2 letters. Amri la chayev, amri la pater. So there's a machlokas. Are you chayev or pater? So machlokas in the Gemara. Amri la chayev mocheku, amri la pater mekalkelhu. Some say that you're chayev for mochek because you're blotting out the black ink and replacing it with red ink. And so therefore you've done an act of mechika. You've erased the black ink or at least faded it sufficiently. And others say you've done an act of mekalkel because you degraded the original darkness of that ink. The Gemara deliberates now. What about witnesses? Are they allowed to, let's say if a witness is illiterate and he doesn't know how to sign his name, can we prepare a sort of like a dotted line of his name and have him just go over, do a connect the dots for him? Would that be, or let's say, can we put a reddish ink of his name and have him write the black ink on top of that? Kevin sheksav elyon huksav, because after all, the Gemara says that that's an act of kosev on Shabbos. So lechatchila, can you do that if you wanted to allow witnesses to sign who were illiterate? Uvi Gemara masik mipnei she'ein medamin naaseh me'asa, I should say. The Gemara says you can't compare the lechatchila and the b'diavad. To advocate that you should do that so that it should be a kosher shtar, that we cannot adduce from the fact that if you do it, you violate Shabbos. And therefore, our conclusion is that perhaps even when you're passing a quill over your lighter ink, witnesses should not do that. And this is true even if you have witnesses who are kosher, who are signing. So certainly that would be true to pass over ink that of someone who's not a witness over the original witness's signatures. That would certainly be problematic. I'm going to skip, maybe just turn the page over because the time is passing. When the signatures are faded, the ink is faded. Ulam yesh letzayin ma shekosav sham b'mishnah berurah lechalik ben kofatz kol hadyo mehaklaf v'nishar rak roshim admumis. The Mishnah Berurah, in talking about Hilchos mezuzah, if I'm not mistaken, says that if all of the dio has peeled off, but there's still left a reddish sort of remnant of the original writing of the letter, da'az imavir alav dio pasol mishum shelo kesidran. So if you write a mezuzah that way, in other words, the mezuzah was completely written, and there's some letters that have cracked off the mezuzah. And so let's say it's mamish in the middle of the mezuzah, and there's a little bit of a remnant of the imprint of the original ink, which a lot of times remains on the cloth. So by filling that in with black ink, you've pasuled the mezuzah, because a mezuzah has to be written kesidron, in order. You can't write the top part of the mezuzah after you've already written the bottom part of the mezuzah. Ela afilo nishar mamashut rak sheniklav shacharut v'nasa adom nechleku baza achronim dedata prima gadam shepasul dedata chsam sofer lahachshir. He says, but that's true. But this halacha, now, what happens if it's not just that all of the ink has cracked off? What if there's just a light layer of ink that's left? So, and you want to go over it with black ink. So that's a machlokes, the prima gadam and the chsam sofer. Because that's the natural fading that happens to ink, and there's nothing wrong, therefore, by just supplementing the current ink with a little bit more ink. That's not considered shelo kesidron, because the original ink is still recognizable, and that the chsam sofer therefore says it's kosher. And therefore, if you just want to be able to strengthen the visibility of the witnesses' signatures, certainly if it wasn't signed properly the first time, it was signed so faintly, so lightly that even the first time it wasn't legible, אז יש לחוש שהוא דומה לדין, לדיו על גבי סיקרא או כדיו על גבי סריטה, דבוודאי נחשב רק הכתב החדש, ולכן אין לעבור עליו קולמוס בשום אופן. So then for sure you shouldn't pass the quill or pass the pen over the ksuva, over the signatures, if you know that a portion of the signature never even took the first time. אם עבר פעם שני, אז אם אבי שחור על גבי שחור, יש להקל ולסמוך שהשטר כתובה כשרה. He says, b'di'evet, if a person did take a black pen and passed it over the black ink signatures, b'di'evet, we could still be machshir the ksuva, even though we said before, lechatchila, you shouldn't do this. Avalim hayu shachor al gabe kachol, but if you took black ink and put it and wrote it over blue ink, yesh lichtov ktuva acheret, then even b'di'evet, you have to write a new ksuva. Im efshel lismach al ha'idei mesira ein, okay, and then that's a separate issue. Okay. So bottom line is that the option of taking faded signatures and filling them in is not an option. And I believe that's true, not only if the husband wants to do that himself, but even if you can get a hold of the original witnesses and ask them to re-sign the ksuva, I'm not so convinced that that would be okay, because they're signing on something that happened years ago. And I don't know that a witness, and I'm just masupik about this, I'm not 100% sure. Let's say you could get the original witnesses and they remember being at the wedding and they remember signing the ksuva. Would that be acceptable or not? I'm not convinced it is, because an aide normally has to sign the document that's being enacted on the same day that the agreement is being enacted. So I don't believe that even that would be acceptable. It would still be a complete signature. If that's, we can recognize that is that person's signature. I think what he's saying is that if you're darkening a space that never had any ink on it at all, because you want to sort of really reinforce that this is the guy's name, that would be even more problematic. Yeah. Bottom line is that lichatchila, you're not supposed to fill in with fading signatures. You should not fill it in with more ink, but rather just write a new ksuva. In Harry's case, I told him, prevent it from further fading by putting something to block the UV rays to get further at it. At some point, you may want to check it. Maybe in 10 years from now, check it again and see if it's faded further. And at some point, you may have to write a new ksuva. Alan, you had a... Yeah, I don't believe that you would be allowed to do that to the original document. I mean, theoretically, perhaps you could argue that you could do a one-line thing that says that on such and such a date, we discovered that the signatures were faded, and therefore we are reaffirming the original terms of the ksuva, and kinyan was received by the chassan, signed by the two witnesses. You'd have to have some kind of text, I don't know, but it would be some kind of text like that in Hebrew. If you had a sufficient space underneath the text of the actual ksuva at that time, perhaps that would work. I'm not 100% sure. But what's being advocated in this psak is that you should really best to write, just write a new ksuva. And instead of saying that it's irkasa, you say that it's nimchaka. It was erased. Okay, here's another contemporary, someone else, yes, Avi. Right, that's what we're saying not to do. Yeah. Yeah.
You're worried that yeah, you redent it, so to speak, not re-ink it.
I don't know what you mean by redenting it.
Like it's etched, like you can see the signature, like where you can sometimes the ink's faded, whatever you can see.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's not good. You're not allowed to. It's still considered to be invisible. That's not it. Even if you, I believe that if you even though you can see that there was something written, but if it's no longer visible as a distinct color, different from the paper itself, right? It has to be a distinct color from the paper. Okay, this is another contemporary tshuva. I'm not familiar with this posek. Rav Moshe Rachamim Sha'ayo. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. A Sephardi posek, but apparently a Chashava posek. She'elah. Now this happens. This she'elah is based on what is done in contemporary Israel today. Believe it or not, when you're Mesader Kiddushin, you actually have to write two ketubahs in Israel today. Were you aware of that? There's two ketubahs. One is left with the Rabbanut, and they register it, and the other one is given to the Kala. So it's on that basis. Did you ever know that? Yeah, it's something that I saw the last time that I was in Israel. They have the ksuva in duplicate, and I'm not sure. I guess maybe because it's held by the Rabbanut, there's no fear that it's going to be double indemnity that she's going to collect on it twice. But they keep it sort of as in the registry to protect. I guess they want to keep a registry of identity. She'elah ma'aseh shahaya bezug shenisu kedat Moshe v'Yisrael v'asu lahem ksuva kedasu chedin. So the following shaila: a couple got married according to halacha. A husband wrote her a ksuva. V'chafisha zocher hechasen shelo asu ha'etek sheni l'ksuva. He says, to the chassan's recollection, they did not create a second copy of the ksuva. Dahainu sheha'idim chasnu rak al ksuva echas shelo keminhag Eretz Yisrael. So they didn't follow the minhag of Eretz Yisrael, which is shaha chosmim ha'idim al od ksuva, that the witnesses have to sign on two ksuvas. They didn't do it. V'shomrim ksuva hashniya biyad harabanut, and they keep the second ksuva in the hands of the Rabbanut. V'achar kach tzilmu et haktuva. So here's Robert's question. They took a picture of the one ksuva that the husband had given to his wife, V'nasan lo harav ha'mesader kiddushin es haksuva ve'es hatzilum lishmor bevesa. So the mesader kiddushin gives the husband the two copies. One is the original ksuva. The other is what you can have. Just have a copy, a photocopy, just in case if you need any evidence that you were married. V'hazug hazeh hiskiru et hatmuna tachat zuchuchit v'talu et haktuva al hakir b'mokom shemagia l'sham karnei hashemesh. So the couple took the they took the illustrated ksuva, put it under glass, hung it up, and let it hang in the house in a place where the rays of the sun were exposed, were shining on the ksuva. Va'ayedei hachom shahayasham haksuva ezia v'nimchuku shemot ha'edim. Because of the heat, I guess not only did the chasimas fade, the way he's describing it is that they got totally smudged out because moisture accumulated under the glass because of the heat and the humidity, and it completely smudged out the signatures of the witnesses. ועכשיו שואלים אם צריכים לעשות כתובה חדשה, או אפשר להסתמך על הצילום שיש לו בביתו. And now the question that's being asked is, do they have to write a new ksuva, or can they rely on the photocopy of the ksuva that is still in the house? Because that photocopy sort of bears witness that this ksuva that has the smudged signatures or the faded signatures was what originally appeared. So this Rav Paskins tshuva, ein hem tzrichim lasot ktuva chadasha, ve'yocholim lihistamech al tzilum haktuva harishona. He says, he Paskins, no, you do not have to write a new ksuva. You can rely on the photocopy. Heyot v'kaimalan eidei mesira karti. Why? Because we Paskin that even more significant than the eidei chasima, the witnesses who sign the promissory note, are the witnesses who witness the delivery of the promissory note from the debtor to the creditor. And in this case, the debtor is the husband, the creditor is the wife. So as long as there were witnesses at the chuppah, and that's, by the way, why in many weddings, the Mesader Kiddushin is makbid to make sure that witnesses witness the delivery of the ksuva from the husband to the wife. The whole function, therefore, of the witnesses' signatures on the ksuva or on any promissory note is evidence, is evidentiary. It's not an integral part of the promissory note. In other words, if witnesses were to come along on a smudged promissory note, where the text of the debt was carefully recorded and legible, and the only thing that was not legible was the signatures of the witnesses, and those same witnesses came to Beis Din and testified, we saw this note being delivered because we saw the generation of debt being created from the debtor to the creditor, then it would still be a valid promissory note. And therefore, even if the signatures are completely smudged out, a woman could always bring evidence as to who the original witnesses were by referencing the photocopy. And therefore the ketubah is not puzzle. Now, that I think is fair to say as long as we know who those witnesses were. If, let's say, we don't know who the witnesses were, or let's say those witnesses pass away and we have no way of knowing their identities, so then I think that it might be more problematic. But I think what he's suggesting is, as long as we can identify who the original witnesses were, because we have a photocopy of the original ksuva, then you do not need to write a new ksuva, even if the witnesses' original signatures are completely faded out. And certainly, if the signatures are just faded or smudged, but not completely demolished, or not completely invisible. And from this point forward, put the ketubah in a safe place where people won't be able to see it and it won't be exposed to sunlight as well. further protected and prevented from smudging or fading further. Yeah. So that's a very good question. It seems from his psak that you cannot, because he's saying you still need the promissory note. Mistama, you could rely on the Rabbanut's copy of it. Mistama, you could.
And if you lose your Ketubah, and the Rabbanut has a Ketubah, can you run over there, make a photocopy and you put it on?
I don't even know if you need to make a photocopy. You just have to verify that the Rabbanut is holding on to your Ketubah. I don't know. I'm sure these are Masim B'chol Yom in Eretz Yisrael. This was all I could find as far as literature using my Otzer HaChachma and the Bar Ilan. If you find any other literature on this topic of the Rabbanut having your Ksuva at bay, do you have to even write a Ksuva to your Kasai? That's a good question. I don't know what the Rabbanut does nowadays. Do they scan it and discard the original? That would probably be a good question. Say again. I don't think that's valid. I don't think that's a valid promissory note. Al pi halacha, you need the original promissory note with.
I have a question that just came to mind. Is it necessary for both the husband and the wife to know that the writing on the tuba is illegible, or is it enough for the wife to say, let's say, I've seen it. You don't have to see it, but I've seen it. Both of them have to see it.
She has to know where it is.
She has
to know where it is.
But she has to know where it is. But if she says alone, it's smudged to the point where it's illegible, that should be okay for the husband.
I don't understand what you're saying. That should be okay for the husband.
No, I'm just saying. So let's say the wife, was looking through a whole bunch of stuff. The wife all of a sudden says, "Oh, here's the Ketubah. It's illegible." The wife tells the husband, "It's illegible there." We need a new Ketubah, and the husband says, "Okay, fine. I don't have to see it. That's fine."
Well, the husband, if he's smart, will demand that when they go to the rabbi to write up the new ksuba, they tear up the old one. Otherwise, she'll have two promissory notes and will be able to collect twice. Yeah, so I was wondering about that, but apparently because that's the convention, the Rabbanut only holds it as evidence and they will not allow it to be used for collection purposes. That apparently is the reason why they allow it. And apparently that's an already established convention. So maybe it's a backup promissory note. Yeah, it is a form. It's a form that the Rabbanut gives the Masader Kiddushin. Right, correct. Okay, so I think we'll hold it here.